There we go. Okay, so welcome everybody. Today we're taking a step up the great chain of being. We're moving from socially constituted actors, social actors, to social things, social arrangements, social structures, institutions, organizations. We'll spend several weeks on this topic. But generically, I'm calling it social composition. And given that we've spent several weeks now on the topic of social ontology, ontological individualism or micro-foundationalism, the idea that ultimately social entities are constituted by the socially constituted, socially situated individuals who interact, do various things, and conform their behavior in ways which contribute to the workings of a social institution, a system of norms, etc. We're now addressing that question. How is it that aggregation occurs? How is it that composition occurs? How do we get from individual level action and thought and mental frameworks and so forth to institutions and organizations and ideologies and cultures and ways of making wine? Just think about winemaking. What an interesting history. I'm sure there are histories of winemaking, but you can kind of picture it, that it was not a scientific discipline, and yet technique moved by transmission and by observation and by imitation throughout Italy and France and probably into Eastern Europe and so forth, village to village, region to region, with new knowledge emerging about techniques and crushing techniques and fermentation techniques and so forth, not as a scientific discipline, but as a cultural set of practices. And how interesting it would be if we really actually had a fairly specific almost video of the spread of some of the innovations which occurred in that set of social practices. But we could say exactly the same thing about so many kinds of social arrangements and social behaviors. I think of dress codes, for example. In fact, well, I won't go down this road, but Thomas Carlyle, the 19th century critic of capitalism from the right, so conservative critic of capitalism, wrote a book called Sartor Resartus, which is, it's a satire, but it's asking the question, why is there no philosophy of clothing? And he basically goes in a 200-page essay, goes through a fictitious German scholar of clothing. It's really fascinating to read. You can find it as a PDF, but it's tomfoolery. It's satire, but in a very concrete way. The ways that we are dressed, these are social conventions that we're involved in. So wearing a hoodie, I wear a hoodie because I walk a couple times a day, and so this is great for both sun and keeping warm and so forth. But it's also a style, and so wearing a hoodie is a style which probably traveled from someplace to someplace else, maybe Madison, Wisconsin, to Urbana, Illinois. Why would I pick out those two places, by the way? If we're thinking about clothing styles, why is it significant I picked out Madison and Urbana? That's an interesting thought. What do you think? What do they have in common? They're big universities with powerful, dominant cultures and subcultures and microcultures. And there is a fair amount of transmission, cultural transmission. So from Madison to Oshkosh, which is a distance of, 75 miles, the amount of cultural transmission that happens from Madison to Oshkosh is probably limited relative to the transmission from Urbana to Madison or Madison to Urbana. All of those are social conduits of influence. And so when a contemporary sociologist who's interested in style or in fashion or in first names, the proliferation of first names and the frequencies of first names and so forth, you might say these are trivial subjects, but actually they're not trivial at all. It's almost like having a Geiger counter of social change, because it allows you to see the rise and fall of patterns. And you can then, if you can get enough micro information, so names, what's the name of the sociologist who wrote Making It Count? Making It Count, Stanley Lieberson, maybe. He also wrote a book called, I don't know, something like Style, but he tracks the frequency of names. And how would you imagine if you were wanting to do empirical sociology on name choices over time? Any ideas about a source of data? What'd you say?
Hospitals.
Hospitals, yeah. Hospitals. And who do hospitals report to? Well, state records of various kinds, including census records. And I think he works with census records. But the interesting thing is that we have a lot of theories about why certain names become more common at certain times. So after an important bogey movie, there was an actress, I don't know, maybe it was Lauren Bacall, and there was the idea that Lauren spiked as a result of, it became a more common female name after the Bogart movies of the 40s and 50s. And one thing that Lieberson demonstrated was the spike doesn't time up correctly. It actually, the timing doesn't work correctly. Well, it's just kind of interesting because what it allows us to get a handle on is processes of change. What could be more personal than deciding the name of your firstborn? You probably thought about it quite a bit. What would you name your children? It seems like a very personal choice, but what Lieberson shows is that collectively there's a lot of pattern to the choices that are made, and they change, the frequency distribution changes over time, but it changes relatively slowly, and then there will be big spikes and so forth. Well, all of that's by way of saying that aggregation from individual activity in specific social circumstances, the big question for us is how do we get social arrangements which are to some degree binding or causally influential on individuals? How is it that individuals wind up both constituting and being constrained by the arrangements of these structures and institutional arrangements and ideologies in which they find themselves? So I really have kind of liked our little experiment in the past, but I'm going to run it a little bit differently today, because I'm going to ask for commentary from you all on a piece of culture. So this is actually, we're an international group. And so maybe my example won't resonate as well for all of us. But let's begin with the idea of the American dream, that in the United States, social opportunity and change of social opportunity and outcome is very feasible if you work hard and you are meritorious. That's an ideological or a mental concept. So I'd like each of you to think about how would that scheme be transmitted? How would it influence individuals? I'm not asking is it true or false. It's almost certainly false in the United States, by the way. If you were just wondering, are we really that Carnegie land of opportunity? It turns out we're not. We have slower social mobility in the United States and almost any country but Great Britain, I think. It will take 900 years for Brazil to reach anything like a normal Gini coefficient of income at its current rate of change. So social mobility is not happening very fast in most capitalist countries, but the idea is out there. So the question I just want you to explore a little bit, maybe it's not even the best idea to grapple with, but so if you have a better one, go ahead and suggest it. But what I'm asking you to do right now is to consider, how would a young adult have acquired an idea like that if I work hard and get a good education and stay committed to the work values of my culture, then I will do very well. Where do we get that idea? How does it proliferate? How does it become influential? How does it influence behavior? So ideas, variations in those ideas, and influence of those ideas on individuals as they do various things, like choose to go to college, not go to college. Who does go to college, by the way? Who's going to college these days? Any ideas? You happen to know that there's a huge gender imbalance with female young people being first time in college. I don't know, it's like 8 percentage points higher than male. Okay, so you can fold that in if you like. But now I've got a little bit of a thought experiment for you, and I'm going to start with you because I can see you're excited by this idea.
I'm excited. Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can fumble my way through this. Okay, so we're thinking about the idea of the American dream, how it sort of percolates through.
Yeah, and
society.
social opportunity and working hard and the what do we call it? The Protestant work ethic? Is
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of it, I'm guessing, has to do with the kind of media you consume. Growing up, stories of like rags to riches and that kind of thing, and movies that show you like the plucky, tough protagonist who manages to use his wits, and normally his. I mean, I'm not trying to gender it, but like historically, it has been largely his.
Can you think of a movie that maybe had that message?
But I think like most sports movies, right? Like if you think of like Remember the Titans, I guess would be one where it's like the underdogs that like
the Hoosiers.
Sure.
That's a good example. Okay, so the underdog, but sticking with it and being loyal to each other.
And spit and a little bit of red tape.
So okay. So media and who do you listen to? Another variation I'd like for you to be thinking about, is there variation across gender, across religious groups, across regions? Do Protestants have more of the Protestant ethic than Catholics? Do Muslim people have a different view about economic progress than Jewish people or Christian people or non-religious people? In other words, are there variations in this this mentality? So what I'm actually asking is, it's almost like the hardest question for us to be thinking about at the moment. It's how does a mentality get established? How does it vary across a large population? I'm thinking United States, but I could be thinking India, 1.2 billion people with very different ideas about life trajectories. How do mentalities get established? How do they vary over time and place? How do they influence individuals? And how do individuals embody and carry them forward? Anything you want to add to what you just said? You didn't mention families at all, but.
No, I mean, I guess, yeah, it's probably in the way that children are raised. You're taught, you will be rewarded if you do your chores, like the more you do for this family, the more you'll be rewarded, kind of thing. So I guess it could be involved in that as well. I'm sure like there's got to be some interesting dynamics. I don't want to speak too much, but like I'm from an immigrant family in like the most, whitewashed sense of the term. My parents are both French and like immigrated here, and there is part of that as well, right? That you kind of like they made it possible for you to be here, and so you kind of have to make the best of the situation.
Great.
So,
So you just reminded me of another important variation, and that is cohort variation. First generation immigrant, second generation immigrant, and so forth. I spent a lot of my time teaching and doing things in Dearborn, and interacting with a lot of Dearborn students whose parents often came from Lebanon in 1982 after the Civil War. And their life stories are amazing. And people who are, great neighbors right down the street, who fled Beirut, ahead of bombs and bazookas, and it's just an astounding background relative to the backgrounds that most of us have, kind of ordinary middle-class lives. And then again, we can ask the question, what is the mentality of a first generation or a second generation Lebanese origin, Lebanese national heritage person? And how do those mentalities change over time? I'm completely interested in this question of change over time, change over population, over gender, over region. Do Lebanese immigrants in Kansas City have a very different experience than in Dearborn? Anybody have an impression of Dearborn, by the way? What do you know about Dearborn? Yeah.
Has the highest concentration of federal Americans.
Yeah. So that's the largest reputation is that it is the highest population of Middle East origin through many waves. And the waves began in like 1910. I once kind of interviewed, as a non-practicing sociologist, I interviewed a man named Mike Berry. When you go to the Detroit airport, you'll see Mike Berry Terminal. It's the very same Mike Berry. But he was like 85 years old when I interviewed him. And I said, how did your family wind up here? And he said, well, my father emigrated from Beirut in 1910. And I said, well, it wasn't part of Lebanon then. It was part of Syria, wasn't it? He said, no, it was part of the Ottoman Empire. Is that, I mean, it just boggles my mind, frankly, to be interviewing a person, talking with a person who's a neighbor, he lived in my neighborhood, but whose own father had lived under the Ottoman Empire. It's like, if you have French heritage, someone saying, oh yeah, well, King, whatever the last king was, he was a close personal friend of mine.
right.
Okay, so that's your observations. Next, this is a different kind of question for you. In fact, you could change the subject to a different social myth. Should we call this a social myth? Are there social myths in China that you would like to highlight? And then ask yourself or ask us to understand how they proliferate and how they influence behavior. What about work ethic, for example? That seems to resonate actually with Chinese culture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
To some extent. And I also have kind of migration story that also happens in China, but more from migration from rural areas to urban areas.
Mhm.
So maybe the cultural shock is not that obvious, but still the lifestyle is different, and also the kind of occupation that people take part in also different. And to some extent, the work ethic are also different, influenced by the kind of whether with agriculture, where you're taking care of plants, influence with nature, weather, and also working in a factory or housing urban areas where you have a more clearly defined schedule that are work on certain time in a day and work for a specific number of hours to get the grade.
So let me ask a question about a sense of obligation. If let's say a rural person has made some social progress by moving to Shanghai and has gotten permission to live in Shanghai, which I think is a major obstacle, isn't it? To get permission to live in a city if you're migrating. But this person has done that and is now working for a company at a relatively low wage. Does that person feel an obligation to the company and to the boss? Or does that person think, I'm really being exploited and this is a nasty situation I'm in, and as soon as possible, I'm going to find a better location? So is there moral, kind of subjective moral obligation, or is it purely transactional?
Does the amount of effort that person puts in his or her job imply morality?
Well, that would be one way of understanding it. Does the person give high effort even when she's not being supervised closely?
Have you ever worked in a factory?
But my class decides it's not bad if I did it from there. I don't. But I think it's a different mentality, different of work ethic and professionalism in the American. Maybe social applicability.
Okay.
Or applicability.
And coming back to your observation, what do you think about that question about having an obligation to your employer? Is that a part of the work ethic? By the way, I'm already making a mistake when I say the work ethic in the United States, because I've already asserted myself, there isn't one work ethic. There are, it's a heterogeneous thing instantiated in different microcultures differently. Do you think that's a ridiculous thought, or is that an obviously true thought, or just needs to be tested? That there are large differences in the culture of work and employment across a country, whether it's China or India or the United States. Lots of difference. So heterogeneous, we're buying into the idea of heterogeneous mentalities already. Can a person be, okay, I like what you had to say. I was remembering a specific experience I had in Wuhan with, Wuhan is well, I think it would be called a mid-sized city in China, and it's only 6 million people. So, or maybe it's 10 million, it's a very big city, but not by Chinese standards. But in a restaurant, I was with a group of faculty and a department chair. And the guy leaned over to me conversationally. He said, do you notice that the waitresses, he used the word waitress, the waitresses are very rude to us? And I said, well, yeah, they didn't seem that nice. And he said, that's because they're immigrants from the countryside. They're horribly treated and they earn almost nothing. And they don't get any of the tips that we leave. And they're very unhappy in their jobs. So in other words, from their point of view, that place of work is not a place of opportunity. It's a place of just getting by and not a place that they owe anything to. So their kind of moral stance towards the workplace is maybe radically different than, I don't want to go completely out on a limb at the University of Michigan, but an impression I have from the Dearborn campus, where I knew staff at every level, was that there was a pretty high sense of loyalty to the institution. So that, for example, a man who was part of the cleaning crew who cleaned my office just died, and I was thinking about him recently. And he was just always so eager to get the job done right, and there was just a lot of self-motivation involved. That's not true in every workplace, so that's another of those variable things. But we can ask totally interesting questions now. We could have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Unlike a crow, I can't. A crow can estimate the number 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. a crow would instantly say there's 7 people in the room, 2 people online. But I had to count actually. But in any case, we could have 7 interesting research projects on how do these differences in mentality in different workplaces, possibly different cities, and possibly different parts of the country, causally, I'm having a lot of trouble with my mask. It's a brand new mask. It's with a good slap. We could ask the causal question: how are they transmitted? For example, Charles Tilley said to me, he used to be a professor here, and I nominated him for an honorary degree 10 years or so ago, right before the end of his life. So he came and spent 2 or 3 days in Dearborn. By the way, he's another person I did a great interview with, meaning great on his side. Brilliant interview by Charles Tilley, just marvelous. But he was talking about having moved from Michigan to the new school in New York to Columbia University. And the comment he made was very different levels of morale among faculty. At Michigan, good morale among faculty. People liked each other. They were cooperative. At the new school, highly competitive, nasty, both faculty and staff, just a horrible place to work. And then he said something that not a single one of you in your academic careers, and I certainly could not say either. He said, so I just walked down the street and went over to Columbia and said, I'm ready. Give me a job. That's not a common trajectory in an academic career. To just say to your former institution, you guys are too awful and I'm leaving and I'll just take my job at the next Ivy League university down the block. But the interesting thing to me is that's micro culture. It's culture at Michigan, very different from culture at New School and very different at Michigan. Okay, so that's good. I'm turning now to our studio audience. Devin, you've been following this. Now, what do you have to say about how work ethic or work culture is created and is impactful?
So I think that we've touched on how these ideas are reinforced in lots of different ways, right? Through, like Lisa mentioned, the media that we consumed. We also talked about parents, how you're raised. But I think a lot of different social interactions have the opportunity to reinforce these ideas, like not even just within a work setting. And it comes from like figures of speech, like it just sort of permeates our, like, how we frame work, I don't know, in a lot of different contexts and conversations. And it makes me think about how we're talking about how culture and how these ideas persist, right? And it's because like we like grow up and are raised in a system where these ideas are shared with us, right? Like both explicitly and in subtle ways, where it like frames of what's expected of us in the workplace. But then also we help to reinforce these ideas too, right? By sharing them, by using phrases that are, a common terms of phrase when you examine it, help to reinforce some of these norms and social practices. I don't know if that's a super satisfying response.
Yeah, no, that's a good. Well, you touched on a key, which is that the norms influence our actions, but we in turn reinforce or possibly disenforce the norms. There's a collectivization and collective farms in China after rural collectivization were not very productive. And in fact, the Great Leap Forward famine led to possibly 30 million people dying of famine in China as a consequence of the collapse of agriculture. And one of the explanations that's been offered is that on a collective farm, there was always the option of being an easy rider. Anybody have a quick interpretation of what an easy rider might be? It's an analogy with a more familiar economic term. Everybody got the illusion? Easy rider to free rider. Yeah, is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, no, it just
Right.
sounds like so. I mean, the implication is like you're stuck in this, I'm assuming I've never heard the term before. But like if you're stuck in this sort of collective social context, and the one that also is in like Maoist era China, there are strong disciplinary regimes, right? Necessarily you cannot be simply someone who is a complete moocher off the system. Nonetheless, you can go below presumed average desired productivity.
Right, right.
And that could like work out on like a larger
Excellent.
scale between discrete individuals, bringing aggregate output down.
Right. So an easy rider would be a person who does the absolute minimum possible given the existing level of supervision.
Like me when I worked at Starbucks. Yeah.
Maybe. So you're the guy who made Starbucks what it is today. I had an easy rider friend at the Caterpillar tractor factory. And he was the one I think I mentioned last time. He tended to sleep in the men's room for much of the night. The supervisor never seemed to catch him. Just went into a stall and slept for hours. But that was between the hours of like 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. Always took a long nap during that period of time. It was the night shift. That would be called easy riding. And if you're an easy rider in a sociology department, you're a sociology professor in a sociology department, is there does the norm of giving commitment to your students, to your research, to your responsibilities as a faculty person, are there teeth in that norm? What do you think?
Yes, so like midterm review, or what am I saying? The student feedback, right?
Okay,
That you collect.
there's that. That's true.
But much of your career is like a study reputation.
As a scholar, that's correct. So I jumbled them all together, all those responsibilities: commitment to your students and commitment to your research. How about the person who's an easy rider on the student relationship side, but working very hard on the scholarship side? Is that a good professor or a bad professor? What do you think?
Depends on your partners.
Well, inherently, is it good or bad?
I mean, it might be bad, but from the university perspective, it's probably good. They're bringing a lot of money to research. How would they get the name and the status of the department?
So, gosh, that's so cynical, though. Doesn't the university care about the educational success of its students? I can't see any of you laughing, but I have a little bit of fear that some of you are laughing at the question. That's the trouble with a mask. I'm not laughing because I do think that a university has to put priority on effective teaching. I also know, as a former chancellor and a former provost, that it's easy to monitor research progress, hard to monitor teaching intensity. I was looking for something more informal. So a group of, I think sociology here is like, I don't know, maybe 60 faculty members. And do you think that the easy riders would be known to the other faculty members? The ones who don't show up for their office hours and put like one question mark on a paper as a comment. And in other words, very low level of effort in giving feedback, constructive feedback, helping students progress either as a grad student or an undergrad student. Do you think that their colleagues would know about that? Yeah.
So obviously I can only speak from limited experience, right?
Mhm.
As a graduate student and as a GSI, I understand that undergraduate students would read my position differently than that of a faculty member. That being said, considering I've already had in my like less than a year of teaching here, multiple times the experience of students being very forthright and like, oh, you're working with this professor next semester. He sucks eggs. Just telling me that during office hours, or like just completely being like brutally honest sometimes about like what they think of certain faculty.
So what their
members,
strengths
like,
and weaknesses are, so you didn't mention
people
the strengths.
talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so feedback exists,
Yeah.
information exists. I would agree with you. As a person who's been in many departments over my career, I know who's really committed, reasonably committed. I don't mean like super heroically committed to their students, but strongly committed and, taking that part of their job seriously versus those who aren't. You were going to say.
I was just going to say that somebody who's writing made that would be putting more of a burden on other faculty members to pick up the slack.
Possibly so, yeah. Yes, that's true.
If they're not in their office all the time, students are gravitating to people who they see in their office or whatever it may be, or the staff, and that's certainly
Right. And in a very concrete way, my wife, who taught French literature her whole career, she had very high standards. She is also French and had high standards for grammar and composition, as well as literary interpretation. Her colleagues were easy writers, never gave comments on papers. In fact, didn't give papers back. The big stacks of papers would be in their offices. In other words, students got almost no feedback on their grammar. And the result was that the quality of writing in her own classes declined dramatically over the period. She was 32 years at a university. So you're right. It is a matter of, it imposes new burdens on the other faculty person. What I was getting at, though, is it possible to have informal sanctions which lead to a higher level of commitment? So, for example, the easy rider on the collective farm where people are going hungry, is it possible for let's say that there are, 500 farmers, and 100 tend to sleep under the tractor whenever the supervisor is somewhere else. Is it possible for the other 400 to sanction them, make fun of them, make jokes about them, maybe rat them out to the supervisors and so forth? And the answer is yeah. Informal sanctions are very familiar. James Scott, is that a familiar name? James Scott, The Moral Economy of the Peasant. A brilliant political scientist, social scientist, but he wrote a book called Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Strategies of Peasant Resistance. Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Strategies of Peasant Resistance. And what it has to do with is the ways that communities it was actually Malaysia and Thailand that he studied, of just ordinary farmers had of sanctioning the non-social or antisocial behavior, sometimes of their peers and sometimes of their landlords. A particularly annoying habit of the landlord was to hire Japanese tractor leasing companies to come in and do all of the harvesting all in one afternoon, thereby taking away the employment for 200 people. Very annoying because it meant, a lot of suffering for the 200 people. One weapon of the week, it's really quite hysterical reading it, is to knock 2 trees down over the only access to the paddy, and then to stand around laughing hysterically as the harvester shows up and can't get by, has to be radio dispatched somewhere else because it's $200 an hour and it's too costly to keep them waiting around while the trees are removed. He tells a story of a harvester that got mired down in a paddy and was sinking. And the peasants of the village, whose work was being taken by this harvester, just standing and laughing, just having a wonderful time seeing the harvester just suddenly, or not suddenly, but slowly bubbling down into the paddy. It's a book that's really worth reading. He's a really smart person. Smart and interesting person. Informal sanctions, in other words. Now, where was I going with this? You might think there he went off on a story. It didn't have anything to do with what we're talking about, but that's not true. This is about how norms are enforced, how they have behavioral impact. And informal sanctions, I think, was it you who referred to supervisors? Yes, you can have more intense supervision on the collective farm or in the tractor factory or in a department chair could say, okay, look, I need to know what your office hours are, and I'm going to be stopping by periodically. If you're not there, you're going to lose merit pay. That's a possibility. I've never heard of a department chair doing that, but it would be a possibility. That would be a formal sanction. And why would a department chair do that? He would do it or she would do it because either there's really a problem, a very low level of compliance. Is that a good way to motivate people, by the way? They're afraid of the knock on the door, that they're not in their office for the office hour, and therefore they show up for their office hour. Is that a good way to motivate them, or are there better ways to motivate people to keep their office hours and write comments on papers, on student papers? What do you think?
I feel like that probably wouldn't work well for someone in the position of a tenured faculty.
Right.
These are people who generally have like inflated sense of self-worth, also very strong job protections.
Right.
If the person is, on the other hand, an adjunct lecturer who is always like one wrong move from getting kicked out of the university and sent to some other university 600 miles away for an equally poor paying job, you might be able to abuse the hell out of them to make sure that they do whatever they want. It would probably be relatively easy, assuming they don't have a lecturers union, to get them to show up.
So even there though, so what I was actually kind of coming around to is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And if you were interested in motivating an emergency room staff, a group of sociology professors and instructors, a group of an ambulance team, if you were interested in motivating them to do their very best work, a really stupid boss would say, I'm going to be really harsh for non-performers. So it's all about the stick. Whack, whack, whack. Well, you can see, I think that's not a very effective way of stimulating high motivation. What's a better way? A better way is to inculcate in some way. What are we doing? We're creating a social arrangement which has force. Inculcate in the participants in the ER, in the ambulance company, in the sociology department, an internal motivation on the part of the individuals who don't have to be hit with a stick to keep their office hours, but who rather do it because they have come to realize I actually can make a difference for the students I help, and it's part of my definition of my role, and I care about that. So intrinsic motivation, enhancing intrinsic motivation, you might say that's an important part of the normative scheme of the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you're going to make a comment, Devin.
Yeah. I was just thinking it goes beyond punitive measures too. Like could be a reward system of some sort. Like if you're trying to give them a bonus or whatever kind of perk as the extrinsic motivator for their behavior, it's still the issue is that if that motivator or that threat of punishment is to go away, then the behavior isn't sustainable, right? You constantly have to monitor and check for it. Whereas if you're appealing to like intrinsic values, more like the person's interests and what motivates them and drives them internally to do something, then the behavior is more likely to be sustained over time. And
Right. Well, I think that's entirely correct. And there's a further example. You haven't yet had the 45 years of experience in universities I've had. motivating people by giving special perks or bonuses or whatever is so often ineffective, because what it creates is resentment in others rather than pleased acknowledgement on the part of the people who are being recognized. And often that resentment is completely justified. That the bonus or the good merit assignment is not justified by the evidence, but rather by some kind of personal relationship with the department chair or the associate chair or whatever. So the idea of favoritism comes in a way that actually pushes everybody else's desire to do their work well and fully down. So both punishments and kind of immediate rewards, bribes, etc., seem not very effective at generating a high level of engagement with the work product. When I was provost at Bucknell University, which is a private university, with a really Neanderthalic board of trustees who had graduated from Bucknell in the 1950s and really thought those were the best years, the 1950s. Yeah, exactly. In fact, their vision of the future was back to the 50s. But as provost, I was instructed by the president, who his views were exactly the same as mine. I was instructed by the president to create a fine-grained, impactful merit salary system, which aligned merit increases, significant parts of the annual salary increase, to performance in research, service to the university, and effective teaching and student cultivation. Okay, so the three areas of faculty work. And I made the case back to the president. This isn't, and the president actually was kind of inexperienced as a faculty member. He hadn't been a faculty member very long. He said, this isn't how faculty members are motivated. They're motivated because they care about research, they care about their students, and they can even be brought to care about working on a tenure committee or whatever. So we need to cultivate that internal motivation. And he was brought to agree with me. He conveyed that to the board, and the board said, well, that's fine and good, but we insist. And so we hired two very famous presidents of universities. One was president of Williams College and the other of, I don't know, Brown. And so they came and did a consultancy. It's a merit pay system, a good system for motivating faculty pay. They wrote a report for like $40,000, which came to the same conclusion I had argued. Internal motivation is 90% of faculty motivation. So the main thing is to elevate morale, elevate a sense of shared purpose, and basically count on internal motivation rather than external. Once again, the trustees said, sorry, we don't believe that, so we need a merit system. Anyway, I designed them a merit system, but as a math major in college, I gave them a merit system with a twist. A, it led to the same results that would have happened without the merit system. And B, it required knowledge of advanced calculus to apply. And when I left, I left detailed instructions to my successor how to maintain the mathematics of the merit system. It was, aren't there American folk heroes in labor history who messed things up in the production process just as a statement on their way out the door? There probably are. Anyway, I was one of those. Gave them an impossible merit system to maintain. Okay, back to the round robin. Zishin, are you still online there? Would you like to contribute?
Yes.
Great.
Sorry, could you like?
Would you like
kind
to
of-
comment on the basically the topic? How do ideas like work ethic or social advancement comes through hard work? How do those ideas influence individuals, and how are they implemented and established by individuals?
I think probably is like it impacts like individuals' ideas, and then like through the individual's ideas, it became like some of the ideas, like the cohort's ideas, or kind of the ideas of the like a group of people, and then to some extent it had a like a greater influence.
Okay,
It's kind of, yeah, it's kind of.
okay. So I'm going to simplify what you just said to there's a script, and it's kind of an ideological narrative. It is in some fashion imprinted onto young people, and then they, to some extent, maybe not 100%, they absorb the script and act the script out. Is that kind of what you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Okay. The very same James Scott that I mentioned wrote another book. What is the title of his other book? I reviewed the book, but I'll tell you that the concept of the book, it's a little different from an empirical piece of sociology because it's a study of English novels of the 19th century, and it's Gramscian. So the idea is, it's kind of a critique of the idea of bourgeois ideology. So there is the idea, the kind of, I don't know, Marx Engels idea of ideology, that there's a mental framework which is conveyed by a class system, and then we robots embody that ideology and we behave accordingly. And Gramsci had the view, no, there's a lot more opportunity for conflict within a set of ideas. I think the title of the book is called Domination and the Arts of Resistance. Or was that the other book that I just mentioned to you? I think maybe that, I'm probably confusing two books, one about Malaysia, one about English literature. But anyway, his point is that when we read these books of English literature, we have landlords and we have peasants. And the landlord has a script, and the script is very definite. Here's how you treat the landlord when he comes to visit. You doff your cap, you're very polite, etc. But what James Scott identifies in the novels is that there's the public script, which everybody buys into because it's in everybody's interest to buy into it. But then there's the hidden script, which is completely different from the public script. The hidden script is the one which is sardonic about the idiot landlord. Did you see how bald he's gotten and how fat? And maybe some ribald humor of various kinds. In other words, what Scott is basically saying is that, and he's kind of attributing this idea to Gramsci as well, that in a situation of social conflict, it's very difficult to completely baffle and mystify the people who are dominated. They come to have a realistic perception of their social arrangements, but they also have the realism to realize they can't really express those ideas except indirectly and with, maybe a little bit of sarcasm at some point, maybe a little bit of humor. E.P. Thompson wrote a great book about, there were laws in the 18th century about masking. You couldn't wear a mask, or not this kind of mask, but this kind of mask, because masked people were leaving threatening messages to landlords and sometimes burning their houses and stuff like that. So an effort to discipline the rural poor, preventing them from masking, preventing them from stealing deer from the land of the landlord, and preventing them from burning households and whatnot. anyway, E.P. Thompson kind of goes through this social conflict in a fair amount of detail, but the anonymity part of it is what I'm getting at right now. If you are anonymous, it's very possible to be very rude to the landlord and to the aristocrat. It's more difficult to do that if you are face to face in your living room when he's collecting the rent. So Thompson and Scott both kind of agree about the hidden transcripts, and but I think it has some relevance actually for today as well. Okay, I want to continue on around the room. So we have gotten to you for an observation about work ethic or ideas, either in China or in the United States, and how they constrain behavior, how they influence individual behavior. Want to give it a shot?
So I want to, I really want to say, so we mentioned American food. I really want to come clear Chinese food and American food. Because yes, we have Chinese food, and I would say right down the book, and every teenager in China can memorize their slogans. Is that we to make the Chinese food come true, we have to take the Chinese road. We have to carry forward the Chinese spirit. We have to unite Chinese forces. So that's very ambiguous definitions. So how they actually influence people behaviors, I want to say. So my mom is a teacher in China. She not directly worked for the government, but he was working in a public middle school. So every day she had to study some sort of materials through apps in Chinese. So that app will put some CCP history, will conclude some slogans, will conclude some cultures, histories, and after he studies every day, and she will have a quiz. So it's part of his daily job as required. So if she not really finish this, well, they probably will notice some sort of. So before that, my mom kind of open mind to every country's religions in the world. So after the studies through this app for a while, he was kind of become a little bit I don't know how to say that. He was kind of like he started to taste Americans. So I think this also another thing I want to mention is related to my studies. So I study populations. China's fertility is being considered one of the biggest challenges in China right now. Because for the past 2021, we only have a new birth for 28,000. So it's kind of incredible lowest through the history. So a lot of people think bring up a lot of solutions. Now we don't no longer have one child policy anymore. We can have 3 kids, but still the fertility is still pretty low. And some people bring up a solution is to use immigrations to fix the deaths, to keep the death rate to the not negative. So in history, Italian used migration to fix this problem. So some people said migrations will be a solution to fix Chinese population problems. But the way is, in Chinese grade, we said the grade is specific to Chinese. So that's the problem is we have migrations in the future. Are they Chinese? So that's solutions is face a huge
there are kind of a lot of people against this kind of things. So
Right.
I think that's part of my opinion.
So you put your finger on several important points.
Yes.
One is that governments often have a very powerful ideological agenda, which they're interested in conveying. Right now, there are state governments like Florida, which are, but it's kind of shameful, isn't it? Anyone else feeling ashamed right now of the state governments in the United States who are trying to conceal the history of racism and racial oppression by, making it, well, by excluding books and making it a crime or impossible to discuss anything that might be described as critical race theory or LGBTQ studies. And what this is, that's a state, a politicians trying to influence the brain, their, thought processes. So that's one possibility. That's one way in which our mentality is shaped, and you're saying in China, and I think we have a long history. Chairman Mao was very interested in shaping the new socialist man, the new socialist human being, creating through communications and study of the Red Book and group exercises of various kinds. That's a deliberate effort to shape mentality. Are there counter hegemonic? That's the Gramscian. Sorry. Mao and Xi are hegemonic in China. Governor, what's his name in Florida? The horrible governor? What's his name? DeSantis, yeah. He's hegemonic and his Republican Party are hegemonic now. They have a lot of power. Is it possible in Florida or in China for a youth culture to develop its own ideas about race or its own ideas about social justice in China? It's a question for you. Or do political figures have the ability to set the dial for what collective mentality will be? I think the answer is kind of clear. For a while, a political entity can have a lot of influence on at least some collective beliefs. During the Cold War, for example, the demonization of other countries in the United States, the demonization of communism. This was a communications, strategy for creating a set of assumptions about certain political points of view that had a lot of success. But one of the things which I think is interesting for us to be considering is the counter hegemonic influences that are possible. For example, just to take one example about China, the question of whether corruption is the worst thing possible in China, according to Chinese public opinion. It turns out by public opinion surveys that there are big generational differences. Older people who were raised during the Mao period are very much opposed to inequality and the corruption that leads to inequality. Younger people are not so opposed to inequality, but they're very opposed to, according to native speakers who are more empowered to speak about this topic than I am. But what I read, younger people who are more comfortable with inequalities, but very uncomfortable with the privilege of the Communist Party, the privilege of owners of factories who are able to channel wealth into their own hands. And so it's not inequalities. Well, what's the point? The point is that's a really interesting generational difference. And it's not rigged. It's not created by the state. It's rather something which has emerged through the experience of different, cohorts and generations. Okay, we can't dwell too much, and I would like to get through everybody before we get to the next. Yeah, unless maybe now we should switch the question because we've sort of we focused on that for a while. I wonder if I can switch the question. To something that's more structural. You were probably all set with a really great comment. Do you want to go ahead and make your comment then?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I think it's wise, and we've kind of been dancing on the topic. I think it's really wise, I think, to look at schooling as a place where these ideas get transmitted.
Mhm.
And I don't know, but I think schooling is often where we are prepared to become members of society. And in its modern iteration, it seems more designed to prepare us for the workforce. We sit and we take tests and do worksheets in a structured time that we do throughout the day. Our classroom environments are often sometimes competing for grades or competing for placements. There are different tracking systems where advanced students get put into different groups. Learn at a more individual rate. And then even in the course of our school, we're exposed to all this literature, this history, social values,
Mhm.
often set by the state. Our curriculum. Good education builds on itself over time. It's that the values are introduced and
Mhm. So one theme that you introduced was kind of the idea of meritocracy, that we can identify, that a school can identify the most talented and then give them special educational opportunities, and less talented people, and the kind of tracking which used to occur. I'm not sure that it still occurs in American public schools, but when I was in high school, there was a kind of technical track and a college track. And it was hard to move from the technical track to the college track. So the idea, and it's almost like what's being conveyed is not a verbal statement, it's an expectation that social arrangements ought to be hierarchical and, quote, meritocratic, with a subtext. Bezos and what's his name, Tesla guy? Elon Musk, yes.
But we're close enough.
I think he was really kind of an evil guy, but so the implication, once you've been schooled to think meritocracy, maybe you've also been schooled to think, well, then the people who are the billionaires must be meritocratic. They must be more talented. They must be smarter. They must be the super bright ones or the super achieving ones, as opposed to what would a more progressive or egalitarian view be? It would be A, they lucked out. B, they shouldn't have been allowed to accumulate this level of personal wealth. And there's probably a C, but I won't try. Okay, so schooling is an important part of it. On the other hand, what experience have we all had in school? Me in the 50s and 60s, you in the 2010s and 20s. Do students in school just take everything they hear as being the gospel? Well, there's a lot of cynicism and rejection of authority. Isn't that true, or is that no longer true? Maybe kids are more dogmatic than they used to be. What do you think? Are there countercultures in school? Are there counter intellectual schemes in school? It kind of seems that way. The first words I heard in Ann Arbor were a grad student on a bike as I was going to Fleming to an executive officer meeting wearing a tie and a jacket, screaming at me, "You don't need a tie in Ann Arbor." Very directive. But counter hierarchy, counter authoritarian, whatever. So what am I think I'm getting to a point that has relevance to how mental frameworks work socially. Orwell kind of makes us fear that Big Brother, the TV face, will make us all believe exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Or that was Orwell's fear about totalitarianism. One thought, one speak, and so forth. But actually, is that 100% true? Is it 50% true? Is it 25% true? What do you think?
I think the thing that I'm a little, Matt also just said, I didn't speak over it, like, yeah, it's definitely not like, it's functionally impossible to reach that sort of like 100% like threshold of like genuinely held
Mhm.
like belief. But you used the word cynicism earlier, and that kind of stuck with me, that cynicism is not necessarily in any meaningful sense counter-hegemonic.
Right.
I feel
Good point.
weird bringing him up because he's become such a fucking joke of a man in so many circles. But like, I think in his first major English work, Slavoj Žižek in The Sublime Object of Ideology, talks about like how, like in contemporary societies, he sees it like cynicism is like the dominant mode through which like so much like of what is accepted in the world is like the way in which it is accepted. So like, a lot of us might, on some level, not really believe that like the American economic system is meritocratic. Nonetheless, the vast majority of the time, we are all working as if we believed it nonetheless. It doesn't matter if we like really believe it. We get to have this level of ironic distance in which we get to go, oh, I know that it's not true. Nonetheless, like I can say, oh, I'm a very good socialist who believes that like the American economy is rigged, and yet I'm still going into this really advanced PhD program thinking that it's going to like cash out for me at some point down the line, instead of like doing literally anything else that seems like a bit more in tune with.
So you've got conscious thoughts which are skeptical.
Yeah.
But you've got behaviors that are conformant.
Yeah, and like that cynicism, that like sense of ironic detachment can serve as a sort of like, oh, I really know what's going on here, but fundamentally I'm still just playing along with the script that I've been given.
So the cynics I was thinking of when I was still teaching at Colgate University, I was teaching a course called 19th Century Critics of Capitalism. Carlyle, Hertzen, Engels, Tocqueville. Fascinating course. And I was invited to teach it to a high school group in Rome, New York, a very working class city in upstate New York. And the really wild, Kropotkin or Bakunin. Bakunin was the fifth, and that's important to my little story. So there were 25 students, and I was trying to expose them to the ideas of and why it was important, what was difficult about understanding 19th century political economy and change and so forth. And what I could tell all the time was happening behind me was sarcasm, tittering, note passing. And so I finally turned to them and I said, look, it's very clear, you're very disaffected from your high school. What I'm putting on the board here is the theory that you can use to understand the world around you. Engels and Bakunin in particular. You should be listening to this. They had no interest in listening. They were just disaffected and angry. It's just interesting to me. It's not an advanced kind of cynicism that a fellow graduate student might have. It's a 17-year-old cynicism in Rome, New York, who says, I mean, it's like in a Bruce Springsteen song or something. There's no place for me to be going. And these teachers who think they care about me, they're not helping me get any place I want to go. So I can't think of a way that a high school student might put this, and I could say in a classroom, so I won't. We got to take a break. And when we come back, I'm going to set a slightly different challenge for Ethan, but it's going to be more about how structures, as opposed to mental frameworks, both get a grip on us, how they are heterogeneous, and how we contribute to them, as agents, as actors. But let's take, is 15 minutes too long a break, do you think? It's not really? Okay, so 25 till the next hour, whatever that is. Is that okay? I think we can start again. So I said maybe we would shift gears a little bit, and instead of talking about a mentality, we would talk about an organization. So I'm putting a little bit of a curveball in your direction, but I don't think it's that distant from what we've just been talking about. Let's consider an organization a labor union, a big labor union. And let's consider the question of compliance of individuals within a labor union. So you might be thinking of rank and file members who are either considering a work action, not considering a work action. You might consider a treasurer who has control of funds, and compliance means he doesn't steal or she doesn't steal the funds. You might consider a president. So that's the question. How does a labor union maintain its integrity, not in the moral sense, but its boundedness? It's doing the tasks which it has set for itself and getting the compliance of the thousands of individuals who make it up. Is that something you're willing to pick up kind of on the spur of the moment?
I guess I'm willing to, but I'm
Great.
ignorant of labor unions, so I don't know how useful what I have to say would be.
Well, I think you'll, yeah, go ahead. Good.
So, I mean, if I had to speculate, I would imagine that part of it is just the culture that's fostered at the workplace of expecting of worker solidarity, such that people are expected to be a part of the union, to become dues-paying members if they are to keep the organization afloat, to maintain the workers' bargaining power vis-a-vis the employer. I'd also, I mean, I believe that, and I think this might have been, at least for public sector unions, I think there's some problems after that Janus ruling at the Supreme Court, but I think there was a certain extent to which you just have like union workplaces where you just require people to join the union once you achieve a sufficient level, and then basically there's legal repercussions if you fail to abide by that and you want to maintain an employment contract. So then you have that basically formal process of discipline imposed to require people to contribute and
Right.
do their part for the organization.
So far, right to work was what happened in this state, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, which was, I think it was a citizen initiative or so-called citizen initiative? It was change of law. Anyway, maybe it came from the legislature, which made mandatory union membership illegal. So that nurses unions, for example, could not require that everyone in the workforce had to belong to the union. They could require a service fee, but they could not require membership. But so you're talking about a really important part of union activity, which is recruitment of support. But let's move inside the union now. Let's take a really concrete example. There's a strike planned for the University of Michigan, the Michigan Medicine Nurses Union. It's not planned, by the way. Don't freak out. No crisis in medical care coming. But nurses strike action planned for the main hospital on, let's see, today is Wednesday. And there has been some discussion that the leaders have become aware of wildcat action, which will involve burning trash and waste barrels to make their point really emphatic. What the union is willing to sanction is marching with signs on sidewalks according to the regulations governing demonstrations outside the hospital. So the union has expectations of the strikers. At least some members of the union want a more radical action. And now the question of compliance. How could the union either enforce its rules of strike action or possibly fail to enforce and then face other kinds of legal problems? So it's a question of compliance, basically. How do you get compliance in an organization?
It's easiest to imagine how you could have a failure of compliance to answer the second part
Mhm.
of the question, which is just that you have strong-willed union members that want to buck authority and not particularly concerned with whether the more complacent, pragmatic members of the union approve of what they're about to do.
Right.
And so I imagine it would be very difficult to discipline those sorts of people. And I imagine that's how you start to get very disruptive labor action. So I guess the harder question to answer is how exactly you avoid that happening if you're a union organizer. And I
Mhm.
mean, I think it would just have to be, one is like an attempt to inculcate an ethos in the organization that's like, if that basically rationalizes to the workers that we need to make incremental progress. We need to maintain our legitimacy, both public facing and to the people that we're bargaining with. And if you all defect and if you don't do what we collectively decided as a group through sort of a deliberative process, not only are you sort of skirting our will and unilaterally imposing yours, which we all disapprove of and we think is
Mhm.
contrary to this ethos of solidarity, but also you're just undermining your own cause. And so if you have that culture and you have those ideas in the organization, then maybe that's how you can prevent
Okay.
defection.
Good. So that's a nice answer. And that would be the internal compliance, kind of building up the sense of solidarity, the sense of we are a structure, we have an elected leadership, and as union members, our job is to support the leaders once actions have been decided upon, and not to take wildcat actions, which can bring serious penalties to the union. So we can harm the union by, burning trash in trash cans or whatever. So building up internal motivations to compliance, that's a very reasonable answer. Anything else you can think of? Do you know how yeah, go ahead.
I mean, an immediate example that sticks out to me of like bringing in external forces would be the way which during the McCarthy era, the CIO conspired with like the US state to expel members of the Communist Party, make lists of what communist militants within their union.
And kick them out of the union.
Systematically kick them out. So you
Right.
get rid of the troublemakers, the people who are actively seen as part of the problem. And then from there, presumably some of the less politically heightened but passively disaffected can more easily be brought to heel or you don't have to worry about that in the first place.
So kicking them out, is that an effective punishment? It may be, because it means that those individuals who've been kicked out of the union no longer have a platform within the union to make their political case or their labor case. So maybe expulsion is one of the few tools that are available. Anybody know how in the anti-globalization protests, what were they called? The Black Flag, the anarchist Black Bloc. Yeah, how did organizers of protests try to control their contrarian behavior? Any idea about that? Do you know anything about that? Big demonstrations have a major problem of, kind of keeping order. And various tools have been used. The one I'm thinking of is like block captains, that there are individuals who've been appointed to, in my hypothetical case of the strike at the hospital, there might be 6 respected union officers who are asked to be on site and to go over and use their own powers of persuasion, to the extent that they're able to persuade people not to burn trash, not to break windows, etc. There isn't a completely easy answer to the question, but you made a very nice start to it. So let's move on. What's your thought about compliance? Let's take corruption instead of behavior on the picket line. Vice presidents in charge of the education fund who have access to hundreds of thousands of dollars, kind of loose cash. How does the union management prevent them from stealing?
It seems similar, like you could have a combination of like social pressures, but also potential legal action or more like tangible policy measures where you like revoke privileges.
Well, stronger than that, though, if it's stealing, that's a crime.
Yeah, legal,
So,
legal action.
Threatening criminal prosecution would be certainly a measure that might be taken. And who actually does that in a company or a labor union is a company? It's a big formal organization with delegated powers and people with specialized tasks. So do you imagine that the UAW has an accounting function, an internal audit function? For sure.
What I was gonna say was because I'm presenting on 16 of the academy.
Mhm.
I was gonna
Cool.
appropriate their language to talk in terms of a hierarchical strategic action field instead of and so well that's interesting because what you might be describing as a hierarchical strategic action field that is being pressured by a non-hierarchical group of coalitions that see coalition building rather than hierarchical management as the effective tool in organizing. But the idea that there are incumbents, right?
Right.
Or they're relying on things like the origin myth of the labor movement, right? To kind of clients, what good it does, like you can mention collectivity versus work better as a collective than individual.
Mhm.
But the idea that there's always going to be that contest, I guess means that they are always trying to find new ways to pull people together in under one kind of like hierarchical lines. What makes me skeptical about that is that my brother is a disillusioned labor organizer for the SEIU in New York.
Mhm.
And one of his big projects was to go up and basically be like a congressional whip and go. The elections are coming up, so you need to go up and whip up support for the appropriate or the chosen candidates
Mhm.
within the union. And so you have this kind of like incumbent organizational structure that makes it difficult for people to actually introduce new ideas, right? And when they do, then it's disruptive to the entire organization. And if you take them out, the problem with that is that then you're risking the creation of an entirely new organization within the same industry, right? So it's within the union's interest to keep those wildcats in the union so as not to, in the same industry, create a new organization that may disrupt their own ways of organizing. So it's like this constant negotiation where you kind of say, to look at and again, stealing from the educational fund. These are workers, right? These are workers and their families that were going to school. Why would you do that? And this is kind of against the whole idea of solidarity. But I mean, if you're bent on doing that, you're just going to do it. Maybe
Right.
just don't believe in solidarity.
Which has an implication.
Right.
And you may believe in solidarity, but also think, yeah, I need a little solidarity myself. Do you know the location of the United Auto Workers in Detroit is called Solidarity House? I don't know if you knew that. That point about different levels of strategic action fields is, I think, very relevant to labor unions with regard to one set of issues, but maybe not with regard to corruption. Because any organization, a university, the IBM Corporation, a hospital, or a labor union, they all have the same problem, that there are resources which could be stolen. And so they need to have processes, coercive processes, punitive processes, and dangerous processes. Dangerous in the sense that they impose real risks on people who do the stealing. The University of Michigan has had only a very small number of major fraud crimes in the 20 years I've been associated with the university, but they have occurred and they've gone immediately to the district attorney. Prosecution happens immediately. So using law enforcement to file charges and to exact legal punishment, but you can't do that until you have information. And so having an audit function and having a system, in fact, a good audit function, a good accounting system, is actually designed not to catch people. It's to make it clear that you will be caught if you do not conform to the rules concerning cash management. And the few cases I'm aware of at the university involved weirdly complex conspiracies between one person who's a purchasing agent at the Michigan Union, another person many offices away in, I don't remember the details, but it was, in order to expend major amounts of money at the university, you need two signatures or multiple offices to approve. So in order to steal, well, how do you steal? You don't say, deliver $50,000 to my car, it's parked right out front. Rather, you have phony contracts or you approve purchases which are shadow, non-existent contracts. That's what, that's the kind of fraud and theft which an organization is subject to. And smart criminals or people who are willing to steal from their employer can try to figure out ways of coordinating their efforts so as to bring about an effort. Now, you might say they're a strategic action field too. They're criminals operating against a set of procedures designed to detect their activity and then punish their activity and disincentivize other people who might be inclined to follow them. There was one other factor in the UAW, and that is the intervention of the Department of Justice. So the corruption I'm referring to happened in the past 3 or 4 years. And it's just kind of shocking to me because I think of the UAW as a very clean union. But in fact, hundreds of thousands of dollars were stolen by senior officials through the education fund. And the Department of Justice played an important role, which is, of course, outside the organization completely. So could we call that another player? Could we call it, a different part of a strategic action field? But those are the kinds of human implemented restraints and constraints and incentives which allow the organization to keep working, to continue its functioning at an acceptable level of loss. Did you want to make a point?
Oh, I had a question, but just because I was thinking about not the case of corruption, but the case about the protesters that you asked about before, which is you mentioned that rather than the internal compliance mechanism, you propose some top-down compliance mechanism like expulsion from the union. Now, I wonder why that would have any effect if the wildcat can just be terminated from the job directly for committing crimes at the protest.
Right. So I wasn't saying that internal punitive sanctions should replace internal motivation, but rather sort of we need a portfolio of compliance management tools in order to maintain a degree of order. Well, for example, if the truckers in Ottawa start setting fire to their trucks and threaten to burn down the parliament, they're parked right in front of the parliament, they might think that's great theater. Man, that's going to make the network news in every country in the world. So what a great idea. Fill it up with diesel and set it on fire. It's insured anyway. Organizers of that protest have a very powerful incentive to not allow that to happen. So if you are a protest organizer, you need to be paying attention to compliance about as much as the police might be, because you need to be sure that this protest continues to pursue our goals, not the goals of Steve Bannon, who just wants to burn everything down. and that's why I refer to the possibility of multiple levers of securing compliance. But I would agree with you, kicking people out of a union doesn't really, that's not a particularly powerful lever if you know you're going to be kicked out of the union and you can keep your job. If you're in a state, what is the opposite of right to work?
New York City.
If you're in a unionized state where it can be a condition of work, you have to be in a union, then being kicked out of the union is also, being eligible to be fired from your job. So that is a pretty severe sanction. But I mentioned last time the drum movement, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, which was an African-American, more progressive, more radical movement that was trying to push, this is a perfect example of strategic action fields with pressures coming from several angles within the United Auto Workers. And expelling the drum activists was not a very good option for the United Auto Workers for a number of reasons. One is how, what the public relations impact is of firing a bunch of African-American workers. And the other is that there wasn't an inconsistency in the goals. There was a disagreement about how rapidly, how aggressively to push one set of goals versus another. That's a perfect example of strategic action field stuff. Okay, so moving around, did you anything else you want to say on the topic of compliance, or shall we?
Real
Close.
quick, I think Devin has her.
Oh, okay, good, Devin, there you go.
I'm just chomping at the bit because
Thank you.
so I wanted to make a quick pop culture reference to what we're talking about. I don't know if any of you have seen Inventing Anna. It's like the latest Netflix release by Shonda Rhimes. So, culturally very relevant right now. But I think it is a really interesting study in strategic action fields, and particularly how one individual kind of thwarts some of the systems, the norms that are in place, how she manipulates them, and then what the consequences are for her. So it's about what we were talking about earlier, sort of this pursuit of the American dream, where this young woman, she's very young, she's like 26, is able to infiltrate the New York power elite. And this is based on a true story. She, by the age of 26, has convinced all of these like powerhouse people on Wall Street and financing in the fashion industry that she is one of them, and she's amassed all of this capital, this like promised funding to finance a foundation that she's going to launch. But eventually all the legal implications of what she's been doing catches up with her after like 5 or 6 years. But it's just incredible how she was able to sort of amass power and agency, and through controlling information, working what she knew about social norms, and sort of to thwart the system. So it was kind of like a worst case scenario of what all these individuals are trying to prevent. But it made me
So it's an example
think
of
about
strategic activity by one individual.
by one individual, yes. But it just
network or a system for subverting, but really serving her own interests. But yeah, cool. That's interesting. What's it called then?
It's called Inventing Anna.
Great, good observation. Okay, let's get one final comment on compliance, mentality, ideology, or whatever you would prefer to contribute to. You're checking your notes, I can tell.
Gosh, I had the final comment earlier on.
So the general idea is, I'm putting it forward that ontological individuals, that socially constituted, socially situated actors create all social forces, all social entities, structures, organizations, normative systems, and so forth. And what we've been canvassing are a few examples how mentalities are both constituted by, but then influenced by, or actually the reverse, constituted by, but then have an influential impact on individuals. So we have this kind of house of cards relationship between the individual actors, maybe the Anna, who are contributing to a mentality, contributing to change in a mentality, which then becomes itself kind of coercive after a certain period of time. And I think in terms of telling the story of the history of the civil rights movement, you could probably tell a really interesting story about how the narrative changed from the 1950s through the 60s, and strategic decisions that needed to be made by civil rights leaders like Dr. King, more conservative African-American leaders who felt that King was too aggressive, and possibly, well, not possibly, white leaders like the governors of basically every state south of the Mason-Dixon line, who were interested in defeating the civil rights movement. We could tell a very interesting kind of strategic capturing the mentality of a nation on the topic of race. And yet, what could be a more influential, powerful mental framework than what came out of the struggle for civil rights? Powerful, heterogeneous, interpreted in multiple ways by different people, but a real substantial change over race thinking in the 1940s or the 1950s. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. And then when I began the question about how do you get compliance in an institution, I'm actually kind of turning to how do these kind of supra-individual facts about mentality or structure influence and constrain the behavior of individuals. And I think we're going to hear from the strategic action field presentation. They do have an effect on individual behavior, but they don't completely control. Anyway, that's the framing. And it leaves you a pretty wide field.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just sort of building up the comment you made just a moment ago, using the example of the civil rights movement is pretty interesting in terms of like, as a case study in the capture of a radical legacy by like the status quo, which I apologize because it's almost become like such a cliche counterpoint over the last handful of years in terms of like what is the genuine like legacy of like the civil rights movement in terms of like, or you know, the figure of Dr. Martin Luther King himself, right? There's always this sort of discourse around the terms around the time of Martin Luther King Jr. Day about like, oh, to what extent can you respectfully or you know intellectually honestly take up his memory to justify a certain line of political action. Like I'm sure we all have like maybe some people here like take up one or both of these positions, like the sort of the figure who like tries to take him on as this sort of like figure of like radical social change, even like socialism, one who's like pragmatic or whose nonviolence was in some sense basically pragmatic rather than deeply ideological, right? But who was like focusing towards like the end of his life on opposition to the war in Vietnam and ties towards the labor movement and this sort of like other element that gets, you know, sort of probably much closer to the version that you learn about in school, to go back to the discussion of like an ideological apparatus like education, right? This very not quite, but somewhat colorblind representation of them, you know, speaking of the March on Washington. There's a way in which a dominant narrative, this sort of centrist, like colorblind racial ideology can incorporate a much more radical tradition on its own terms.
Meaning it can be kind of tamed to what is in the end not a very aggressive stance on racial equality. So I have a dream speech can be turned into, we're all living in peace, so don't rock the boat. I'm just extending your point maybe a little bit.
It's like it's something like that is a quote that fundamentally, you know, you just think it's like the most popular right winger in like America. I don't know. Tucker Carlson would have no problem citing the "I Have a Dream" speech as part of the sort of tradition of like, as part of the American tradition, for example.
Mhm.
And simultaneously, like that nonetheless has an implicit, it's understood with a certain like liberal or progressive political valence. Nonetheless, anyone can feel comfortable with like that aspect of his legacy.
Mhm.
So like so much is cut out. I apologize, I'm losing my train of thought.
Well, the color of your skin versus the content of your character, that's exactly what these anti-CRT people are arguing, right? They're saying like, no, CRT is racist because we're not being judged by its content of our character, we're being judged by these kind of historical processes that have nothing to do with us.
I have a whole series of wonderful clips, but I'd like to play one of them for you. I'm not sure if it helps or doesn't help, but it's very short. It's 20 seconds. To me, what is so powerful about that is it is not the can't we all live together kind of soft nonviolence stance. It's a very powerful, a very strong statement of character on its part. Stokely Carmichael has just spoken from the same truck saying, you've all got shotguns. These people have attacked us. We need to shoot them. So Stokely Carmichael has just spoken on this truck because it's a truck convoy that was attacked in, I think, in Alabama. And Dr. King then spoke. But have you ever seen a speech of Dr. King's which has that passion, that degree of passion? He's usually very measured and calm. Maybe I'm dealing from a different deck of examples of Dr. King, but this speech has huge passion to me and huge strength, which says that Dr. King was aware of the carnage that white racism creates. And he had a conviction about the only way it could be defeated, and that was through courage and not a violent response, but a massive popular response. I've got a bunch of posts on the Deacons for Defense. Is that a group that you've heard of? Deacons for Defense, and whether they were an important part of the civil rights movement or not an important part. And the sources that I refer to think they were a very important part because they, in Alabama and Mississippi, constituted, you don't like Dr. King, we're still not going to let you kill him, and we're not going to let you kill civil rights workers. Okay, I got to pause this part. This was, to me, a really valuable series of conversations, and we've got more than half an hour.
I think we're splitting though, technically. Both of us are going today, or are supposed to
Yeah,
go today.
you're both going today, and if we have to go over by 5 minutes, nobody's going to kill me because I'm going to
They
play
might
that.
kill me.
I'm going to go with that same speech from Dr. King
Perfect.
and will not have violence. Do you have any audio visual?
I do have the PowerPoint. I don't know what the easiest means of presenting that would be.
Maybe if you just quickly email it to me,
Okay.
I'll pull it up and then let you control it from here. To DE Little. Actually, while you're doing that, would you let, maybe Matt should
Sure,
begin.
that's fine, yeah.
Do you have anything you wanted to put up, or are you just going to talk?
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you start and try not to go more than 20 minutes so we can.
Yeah, I have no idea how long this is going to take.
Okay,
5 minutes. Okay. So this article that we read by Neil Flickstein is highlighting the kind of less useful generalities emerging from research in the intersection of social movement studies and motivation theory. They argue that social movements are under-theorized, and wedded to a typology of actors using social movements, organizations, etc., that obscures the central structure and nature of all strategic collective action. So what they offer in response are strategic action fields. And they say the task at hand is explaining the underlying structure of and sources of change and stability in institutional life in modern society. They're introducing basically a unit of study that maximizes the kind of complex and dynamic view of a more complex you say that there's this constant jockeying going on in these fields as a result of their contentious nature. Actors make moves, and other actors have to interpret them, consider their options, and they argue that scholars in social movement studies and organizational theory, although they borrow from each other, more so from organizational theory. They say that they argue that they're still siloed in their own fields, and they're making an argument to say that they both have the same impulses and should be studied together. They say that scholars, organizations, and social movements are interested in the same underlying phenomenon, collective strategic action, and collective actors. A meso level vying for strategic advantage, and then those strategic action fields themselves constitute the complicated web of interactions between action. So the theories are insufficiently general, and to tell us much substantive about contemporary society. And they argue that they are borrowing from previous scholars of social movements such as Anthony Giddens, Bourdieu, and some new institutional theory, but are trying to they accept many of the premises from there and then try to convolute that further. So the main elements of the theories are they define strategic action as the attempt by social actors to create and maintain stable social worlds by securing the cooperation of others, and that they are fundamental units of collective action in society. And again, a strategic action field is a meso-level social order where actors, individual or collective, interact with knowledge of one another under a set of common understandings about the purposes of the field. And they describe strategic action fields like Russian dolls in that they are themselves constituted by even more specific strategic action fields. They are constructed on a situational basis, and there are power dynamics involved which may be done in oppositional position taken from within the action field. They can be hierarchical or coalition based. So the way these types of strategic action fields are either political coalitions or a hierarchical structure. But one of the things that struck me is they seem to focus on the hierarchical rather than the political coalition. And in that, focus also on competition. I think a lot more than is necessary and probably confusing ways, because they also acknowledge that competition is not necessary for these the way that these are constructed. But they get talked about that later. We discuss this afterwards. So some of the elements of the strategic action fields: incumbents, challengers, and government units. Incumbents are those actors who wield disproportionate influence within a field. Challengers occupy less privileged niches within the field, and ordinarily wield little influence over its operation. And sometimes government's units within strategic action fields are charged with overseeing compliance with field rules and in general facilitating the overall smooth functioning of the system. One requirement for the creation of A strategic action field is social skill. It's involved when people want to produce collective action by engaging others. It's how individuals or collective actors possess a highly developed cognitive capacity for reading people and environments. So basically, you're good at talking to people and organizing people and convincing people. The fields themselves are embedded in, again, a complex web of other fields. They set out three sets of binary distinctions that relate to strategic action fields, and they're kind of self-explanatory, but there's distant and proximate. Of course, the proximate strategic action fields are going to have more effect on one another than distant ones. Vertical and horizontal, are these strategic action fields are they structured in such a way that one has more power than the other, or they hear strategic action fields in some way. And then there's state and non-state. And the state is implicated in that they are often creators of space for new strategic action fields. There are exogenous shocks, ruptures, and intention. They bring like McAdam-Trillian heroin to discuss contention. The main theoretical implication of interdependence of fields is that it's the source of a certain level of rolling turbulence in modern society, something that they also call change pressures. So they're basically a highly contingent outcome of an ongoing process of interaction involving incumbents and challengers. The expectation is that when a single member of the field begins to act in innovative ways in violation of field rules, this is about creating tension, others will respond in kind, precipitating. And so they describe episodes of contention as being defined as a period of emergence, sustained, continuous interaction between actors utilizing new and innovative forms of organizing. And besides innovative action, the two significant hallmarks of contentious episodes are a shared sense of uncertainty and crisis and sustained mobilization by incumbents and challengers. And finally, the result is it often results in a settlement that through either sustained oppositional mobilization or the reassertion of the status quo by incumbents and or their allies, the field begins to gravitate to a new or refurbished institutional settlement regarding field rules. In terms of stability and change, they say that strategic action fields tend toward one of three states: unorganized or emerging, organized and stable but changing, and organized and stable but open to transformation. I thought that was interesting because that's like the kind of baseline they have to be open for transformation. They say there are a couple of really interesting quotes. Oh yes. While material resources remain a powerful weapon, on page 13, in the struggle to shape the broad cultural contours of the emerging field, it is quite possible at this stage for a coalition of relatively impoverished groups to band together under the tutelage of skilled strategic actors to overcome better endowed groups. This kind of fluid situation is the least easy to make predictions about and likely to yield new and innovative forms of organization and action. And in terms of the destabilizing effects, this is so no, not our class, this is another class. But we're talking about Marxism. But in terms of it becomes more destabilizing as fields become more involved in these crises. So basically, as it goes out from adjacent strategic action fields, it takes on a greater possibility to destabilize more structures. they introduce 16 propositions, which basically they are offering a description of some of the dynamic processes that action fields go through, including that they're stable when they have role structures that are based on either hierarchical incumbent/challenger structures or political coalition, like I mentioned earlier, or one proposition is initial resource allocations affect whether or not SAFs become organized hierarchically or cooperatively, and also states aid in the creation of new social space as intended and unintended consequences of state action. So there are 16. I'm going to talk more about those specifically. But they had a critique that I thought was maybe a more powerful critique. But really, it's just that it didn't go far enough. So, rather than critiquing other, I guess, schools of study or schools of thought, they're actually critiquing their influences themselves and why they're kind of stepping in to improve them. So for review, this is focus on individuals acting in fields. Means that this theory is relatively silent on the problem of collective action. It's not just individuals seeking advantage, but groups also seeking advantage. And there is little on how fields are formed in the first place. One of our critical insights is that the formation of field resembles a social movement, because all the possible understandings that go into construction of an SAF are up for grabs. Basically, invoking the kind of emergent form of strategic action. Start getting at how to form. They say that Anthony Giddens has a much more general and vague idea about social structure, which he terms structuration. I was hoping to discuss a little bit about that more because they introduced it, but I didn't understand what the criticism was. I don't know what structuration is. Institutional theory is really a theory of how conformity occurs in already existing things, and it greatly underestimates the role of power and structure. And then finally, the network analysis, they kind of mention and kind of bring it up just I don't know, it just kind of seems like they can out of obligation. But is a technique that they say is to model whatever the analyst thinks is most important about the set of relationships.
It's a very complex set of topics that they're undertaking. I really like the summary that you gave. If you have notes you'd like to share with all of us, we'd be happy to post them. I think the Giddens point is structuration is his grammar for indicating that structures are not fixed, that they're created by actors. So agency structure is not a firm distinction for him. Rather, agents make structures. Structures are in a process of change almost always, and that if we political scientists especially like to distinguish between agent and structure, and Giddens is of the opinion that it's kind of a false dichotomy. Agents are in structures, structures are composed of agents. Agents are changed by the structure, structure is changed by the
So are they saying then that it is a structure, is their strategic action?
No, because Giddens is more of a holist. So he seems to be talking about structures in a really big way, like capitalism as a structure. And their view is more meso. You mentioned several times that strategic action fields are meso level things. I wonder if you would all maybe agree with the point that strategic action fields seem to have most to do with informal processes of conflict and strategic efforts to bring about a certain outcome. And that is only partially relevant to the workings of a formal organization. We don't like formal organizational theory. We're going to read some formal organizational theory in a week or two. I guess it's about 2 weeks. But it's a little bit challenging to figure out exactly how a Ford Motor Company, the way I've tried to think about it is the different units like manufacturing unit, vice president, sales unit, and credit unit. Those vice presidents all have different interests and they have different resources available to them. And yet they all want a certain policy, but it's a different policy. So they're competing for policy at the board level. That's the way I think of strategic action field within a formal organization. And that's kind of relevant. Anyway, nice job there. Let's make sure we get the second presentation here, and I'll get you keyed up. Then you can- Okay. There you go. I want to share the screen again so that your presentation is shared. And
On the
let's see if
right hand side, oh, there's a slideshow, I believe.
okay. Slideshow. Oh, that's
Yeah,
easy.
it should be there.
Okay. So
Okay.
there you go.
Yeah. And I'm sure everybody is super excited and awake at
I'm
8:30 p.m. So I'm gonna do my best to jazz things up a little. So we read the first 2 chapters of Kathleen Phelan's How Institutions Evolve, and I'm covering chapter 1, which basically is just an overview of why this book matters, what it's trying to argue, where it sort of situates itself in the literature, and what we're supposed to take away from it. So an overview, sort of setting the scene. This, as globalization continues to become, more prevalent in every facet of our life, there have been competing theories about the evolution of economic institutions through this lens of globalization. Some people believe that economies are converging, that everything is sort of being driven into an ever more competitive and faster cycle where deregulation is king, everything else is going to fall to the wayside, which has some institutionalists worried about what Phelan calls embedded or organized institutions like the German sort of model of economy or the Japanese model of economy versus these liberal economies like the United States and Britain. The other sort of camp believes that the separation persists and that just the structures that are in place in these countries themselves will make it very difficult for these to actually move towards a point of convergence. Some theories have a sort of a view of a tight institutional coupling that basically everybody's held in a chokehold based on the dynamics that these different institutions have with each other, and they very strongly dictate economic behavior, which means that if one part fails, then the whole system fails. So a little bit monolithic in that regard. Other theories are a little bit looser. They talk about political structuring, so there's more mobility, things are less tightly bound, which means they're also a little bit more volatile, but if one component fails, the system can theoretically absorb that shock. So Phelan is asking, are these theories sort of going in the right direction? And how can we know who's right? Are economies converging? Are they remaining sort of in the pathways that they've been in so far? So her premise is that in order to understand the likely futures of the institutions that make up the different varieties of capitalism, we need a better sense of where these institutions came from, what has sustained them, and what are the ways in which they have changed over time, which is a pretty solid sort of overview of her goal for this book. Oops. Oh, no, it's not gonna let me do it. Okay. So her approach, she is focusing on firm-based training for blue-collar workers. And her book is made up of two components. The first is a cross-national component, which compares the dynamics of unions, employer organizations, and skill formations through the turn of the 19th century in 4 countries, Japan and Germany, which she says are made up of embedded or organized economies, and the United States and Britain, which are her examples of liberal economies. So the questions that she's posing with this cross-national component are, why did different countries pursue such different trajectories in terms of plant-based training? How did the evolution of training institutions interact with the development of collateral institutions and organizations? And then the goal of this component is to situate a number of country experiences within a theoretical framework that can illuminate causal mechanisms at work across a number of cases. So these experiences are part of a larger scaffolding that we can then maybe use to interpret other instances of global economy trajectories. The second component is a longitudinal component, which aims to understand the evolution of Germany's vocational training system from 1987 to the present day. So this one is a little bit, it follows through a little bit longer than the slightly more truncated cross-national component. And here, the longitudinal context for Germany, the reason that she picked Germany, is that initially it was an authoritarian government that set up the vocational training system in order to shore up an artisanal or handicraft producer base against the radical working class movement. So you might think, how did that eventually lead to a relationship where there is a sort of deeply intertwined dynamic between the industrial sector and labor unions, right? Since they seem to be, at least at the offset, somewhat diametrically opposed. And then the goal of the longitudinal component is to account for striking continuities in key features, despite Germany's pretty volatile history of regime changes, incorporation of the working class, impacts of 2 world wars, occupation, and transitions in and out of fascism. And sort of this also, the longitudinal component also serves to give a deeper dive into the concept of institutional reproduction. Her methods are primary and secondary document analysis. Obviously, this is a sort of historical undertaking or account, so that is what she's working with. Moving right along. So why focus on skills? There are economic and social implications that speak to the value of focusing on skills when looking at global institutions, or I guess at this phase, national institutions. So the economic stance on skills is that skills and investment in human capital are the engine of growth, that there are solid links between skills and productivity, and that they play a central role in endogenous growth theory, which is basically the idea that a country's knowledge base is the source of its innovative power. So you have to invest in the skills of the country in order to keep it more or less competitive and innovative on the global sort of stage. The social implications, or the reason that we study skills in a social setting is that skill formations impact gender inequality and diverging social policy regimes, income inequality or equality in liberal or organized economies basically dictates sort of the political landscape or social political landscape in the countries in which they operate. And so Phelan points out that the literature has shifted from an effort to identify differences in the quantity of training cross-nationally, which historically has sort of lauded the efforts of Germany and Japan, to a more nuanced analysis of the mix of jobs and qualifications in different political economies, where the United States is given a little bit more credit for offering plenty of opportunities for sort of niche or higher skill labor, and isn't just, I guess, repudiated for not providing as many opportunities as these embedded economies do. My God, where am I? Okay, so what do the economists say about sort of the roles of firms in institutions? One of the biggest, I guess, conundrums that firms face is finding the balance between training workers for themselves and the very real possibility that these workers will be poached from them, or on the flip side, that they can just save those costs and poach other workers and not have to sort of offer any form of training. So Becker said, don't worry about this. This is a non-issue, because what you're really looking at is generic or general and specific skills. Neither of them are the firm's concern. General skills, the worker is incentivized to learn him or herself because it's going to allow them to ask for higher wages or basically get wage compensation as a marginal product. So they're going to go out and do that on their own because they want, a higher wage. And then specific skills are only relevant to you. So nobody's going to try to poach your workers because they don't want what your people are offering. So in Becker's theory, the limiting factor is capital market constraints, because the workers have to have the means to go out and seek this general skill training. And if they can't, then that's sort of what is hamstringing the skill level of your labor force. But Becker's analysis has sort of come under fire. I mean, it is a pretty cut and dry economics analysis. There's not a whole lot of nuance there. So arguments have been made that there should be a third category of transferable skills, that this distinction between general and specific is a little too cut and dry and doesn't really consider the fact that some specific skills might actually be transferable between professions. And then again, this idea that general skills are something that the worker will automatically pursue because it allows them to bump their wage, as a marginal product, is assuming a perfectly competitive market, which is almost never the case. And so a couple of theorists have also brought up the example of low market turnover. What happens then? And so Becker is still relevant, but maybe a little bit less than it was before. Why does this matter? So the reason that this nuance is important and that it's relevant to Thalen's work is that historically, interactions of development of the training regimes and labor market institutions have had a profound effect on what kind of skilled labor market employers face, right? So it also influences the options of solutions to address different kinds of market failures, which is something that's important to keep in mind. For example, liberal market economies give lots of incentives for young people to acquire generally marketable skills, because then firms will pay for the specific skills later. So that we can see in the United States and Britain. Meanwhile, in organized market economies, firms are more likely to invest in general training of workers due to low labor turnover or institutions that are preventing poaching or free riding. So understanding that the nuance is really where you can start to account for the differences in the way that national economies are formed. Okay, what's the institutionalists say? So there's been a little bit of a shift away from functionalism, which was gospel in the past, and basically explained the existence and form of an institution based on the functions that they perform. Then actor-centered theory sort of took over for that, but was criticized for being neglectful of the element of coercion. So now what we're moving towards is a study of institutional evolution and path dependence rather than static comparisons. So this kind of ties into a historicist explanation. The processes responsible for the genesis of an institution are different from processes responsible for the reproduction of an institution, which ties rather neatly into what the political scientists say, which broadly is that countries undergo critical junctures. Basically, this idea that there are points in a country's trajectory where they are going to have to employ their agency, and this is sort of a make or break. And then settled times or periods of stasis where everything sort of the status quo is reinforced and everything becomes more and more entrenched. So you've got like blips, I guess, of excitement, activity, everything undergoes radical change, and then in between long periods of sort of stasis. However, there are a couple different schools of thought on how to use this idea of path dependence. Some say that it's okay to just allude to the fact that the past always has a bearing on the directions an institution takes. And then those who prefer more rigid definitions say that you have to focus on the contingency of historic choice points, the big events, the giant blips, and then really assume a state of determinism once a path has been chosen. So again, that stasis in between. Okay, bringing it back to what Kathleen Thalen says. So she builds off of an institutionalist, political science-based and economics-based perspective, but she definitely does not embrace these concepts wholeheartedly. So her take is that cross-national differences in vocational training regimes can be traced back to differences in political sentiment achieved between independent artisans, skilled industrial workers, and employers in skill-intensive industries in the early industrial periods. She says that institutions evolve through incremental change, periodic political realignment, and renegotiation. So again, this idea of dynamism and fluidity and a constantly ever-evolving situation, unlike path dependence, with, she says stasis is basically not something that you tend to see in real life. And that when institutions are founded, there is a contest among actors to establish rules which structure outcomes which are most favorable to them. I mean, that has a pretty strong theoretical backing in economics as well. But she makes the point of saying that at critical junctures, old institutions kind of come into the fold. They're not necessarily dismantled and replaced, but are either recalibrated or functionally converted in part or in whole. And her work also features a strong power distributional component, although she doesn't use the term power, but rather uses the term interest, because it's a little bit, I guess, more quantifiable to think of an actor's interest than their power, which is a slightly vaguer and perhaps more amorphic term. And she also focuses on instances of power reversal, right? Because with this theory of constantly shifting dynamics and coalitions that are built and then destroyed, sometimes you can have a power structure that is sort of flipped on itself based on changes in coalitional foundations. So looks at that as well. And then she has two central mechanisms that she uses to explain change. The first is institutional layering, which is this idea of grafting on new elements to an otherwise stable institutional framework. So again, nothing is ever really created or destroyed. In this case, it's kind of co-opted or added to in institutional layering. And then conversion, where new goals are adopted or new groups are incorporated into a coalitional foundation, which changes the institutional function and role. So as groups merge and mix, suddenly there's a slight redirect in the vision of the institution. I feel like I'm making pretty good time. So I already sort of talked about that. This quote, the only other thing to note is that these possibilities of settlement are mediated by state action, which will tip the balance of power and can either facilitate or aggravate coordination between firms, unions, and employers. I think one example she uses is the fact that unions, maybe it was the guilds that were destroyed in Britain, and then they never had a chance to develop in the United States. And so as a result, there has been a very oppositional relationship between unions and employment institutions, which differs from the fact that there's been a slightly more codependent relationship in Japan and Germany. So, the state action sort of dictates the ties that are built between these. So Thalen makes the case for her approach and compares it to those that have come before by saying that hers is stronger because it doesn't determine the existence of an institution by its function. It doesn't separate between institutional creation and institutional reproduction, which she claims is I guess, a faulty dichotomy. It doesn't really put much faith into that. And she said that it explains coherence across institutional domains and over time. So despite, being perhaps sort of this is a comparative case study approach, the framework that she proposes will be able to apply. Yeah, so I think that's
Really
about
awesome.
it. Thank you.
It's great illustration.
I know, it's nice, right?
Yeah. What a nice introduction that is to Dale. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah.
Comments on either, well, we'll stop in just a moment. I realize you did a great job of navigating right into the doc. You need enough needs to back up here. So any comments you'd like to make about either presentation? Did you notice that there's an important kind of congruence between the two presentations? Strategic action fields fit pretty well into Phelan's idea of the kind of fluidity and change and opportunism, which is associated with institutional creation and change, which is pretty interesting. You mentioned that her research is comparative historical research. You mentioned about the underlying also that institutions in her, I think, have a remarkable level of persistence. In spite of the fact that they're not like iron structures, those beams up there are persistent because they're rigid structures held in place by physics and mechanics. And institutions aren't persistent for those physical reasons. So what does make her persistent? Well, she wants to answer that question. She thinks that there are some really powerful answers that she survived at. Which is one of the reasons why it's so interesting to look at book in the context of these topics about social and politics. The nature of the social work, ontology, how does the social world work? She's very interested in understanding how the social world works. Both how social arrangements get put in place, then how they change and persist. And a more closed-minded person would say it's all about change, or it's all about persistence. She recognizes that we have to find growth for change. Okay, I think I have to respect your bedtimes. I'll go home and read Wittgenstein to roughly 1 a.m. That's good. Okay, thank you. Thanks. These were really excellent. He really asked me that I make some mistakes on the due date for the paper and some really great. I think it's probably a good one. Right. Anyway, I corrected it. That also meant changing the date. So I want to look to make sure that you and I agree on. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Both of you.
Oh, yeah. It would help with engagement, pictures. Please send on camera.